pleasure to be here today and moderate this topic of data and oncology, one of my favorite topics. And before I set the context for the conversation today, I would love to let the panelists introduce themselves because I cannot do fully justice to all of their years of expertise. So let's start with Jeff and Alpa and then Susan.
Great. So Vera, thanks so much for hosting the panel, and thanks to Datavant. I'm Jeff Elton, CEO of Concert AI. We're a oncology real-world data company that does work from translational, clinical development, post-approval medical, and then we also produce AI SaaS solutions that really contribute to clinical research as well. Thank you.
Hi everyone, Alpa Patel from the American Cancer Society. I head up our population science program there, which entails large population health studies of collectively about 1.5 million people that we follow longitudinally for decades.
So my name is Susan Schiff. I'm the president of Ontada. Ontada is also an oncology company. We do oncology technology for community oncologists, data studies, real-world data studies, and education for oncologists.
Fantastic. Well, thank you all for the time and the expertise here today. As a former cancer researcher, it's absolutely my honor to be here with this group of folks. And to think about it, we're at the Healthcare Data Summit, right? So it should be surprising to exactly no one here that at some point or another today we'd be talking about oncology and cancer data. And you know, cancer, of course, is not a monolith, but if you take oncology as an overall therapeutic area, it is the largest therapeutic area by commercial spend, by R&D pipeline, and by innovation. And cancer research is both a great generator of healthcare data and one of the biggest users of healthcare data. So more novel data is coming online, and we'll discuss that, which is incredibly exciting. But as you really think about it, despite all of the innovation, and despite all of the resources that are being put into cancer research today, we are nowhere near declaring victory on cancer. We're still a ways away on our dreams of prevention, of early detection, of increasing quality of life, and really on reducing mortality for cancer patients. So we're here. What's next? Where do we go from here? What excites this panel about oncology data and what's coming online? So maybe we can start with, let's start with Jeff, and then let's go down the line.
Okay. So I think the field and the access to data has actually changed quite a bit. I think when at least we started in some of our history and the legacy here was taking electronic medical record derived data and bringing sets of what might be called business rules or kind of concepts that can be derived from unstructured, which means kind of non-machine readable notes, PDF, et cetera. And that's kind of where we started. And that did provide insights into standard of care outcomes. But now actually the wealth of data coming from, say, genomic testing might allow you to bring together a clinical record with a full exome or transcriptome, or the access to imaging data with radiomics features actually may allow you to not have to rely on the radiologist interpretation report, but the actual image series, and then actually integrate that actually with the full clinical record. So this idea that we're now able to go to true multi-omics-based views and get to a depth that was not associated with real-world data that starts to actually serve translational through clinical development through post-approval, that's actually super exciting to us.
Depth and novelty.
Yeah. And I would completely agree with what Jeff's just said. You know, the multi-omics component, you know, in studies like what I work on, we have those multi-omics both from the tumors as well as germline from the participants over several decades. And then you mix that with, you know, traditionally when I started, which was about a year after Microsoft 95 came out, and we had survey-based data only, and we looked at pretty crude outcomes. So we looked at cancer-specific mortality or breast cancer as a whole. Now we have the ability to really dig into the molecular characteristics of those tumors and gain precision both in the exposure and the outcomes that we're looking at because of all of the different types of data we can bring together. And then the technology. You know, the first genetic study that I did, it took more DNA to characterize one gene than what we need to be able to do an entire GWAS today. Mm-hmm. So I think that there's a lot of progress because of technology that has allowed us to tremendously enhance the data that we have.
No, and I think that progress has allowed us to get breadth and depth of data. So what happened to the patient prior to their oncology diagnosis, then during their treatment, to your point, right? So it's not only the EHRs, but it's all the omics, it's claims data, you know, what's the total cost of care, and then following that patient from the time they leave the clinic and hopefully to survivorship or unfortunately to death. So we have the breadth and depth of data. What I was particularly struck by when Rob Califf was talking about the crap studies that happen in this space, I mean, for me, that's such an important component. You know, there are two epidemiologists on the stage, and we were chatting before about you have to have a scientific question, and then you have to understand how can you answer that question? What's the methodology you need to apply? And then what data source would best answer that question? So it's really understanding the science behind why are we collecting this data? Because there are questions that we can only answer through the utilization of real world evidence.
I'd like to punctuate your last statement because I think historically in real world data, here's a data set. This is what exists. I hope it serves your interest somehow, was a lot of how the field operated. But I think your notion that actually we start with the question now and we actually create the research question and create the methodology because it's easier to confederate data around the question, you can actually let the science really drive it to a much higher quality and a higher quality framework. And I think that's a little bit of what Rob was also kind of encouraging a bit. But that's actually a change in the field's methodology, at least for how a lot of people in the field actually operate. So.
I think that's how the landscape is changing. So I'm hearing a lot about longitudinal data, novel data, deep data. But I'm also hearing, Susan, going back to your point, that data alone is necessary but not sufficient to get to insights. So we should talk about data, we should talk about context, but we should also talk about technology. So what technology, what analytics are you guys seeing coming online in your fields that will really revolutionize cancer research?
No, absolutely. So, you know, there are certain analytic techniques that we used when we were talking about our PhDs and, you know, back in the day when we had our chisel and stone trying to get everything done. But, you know, there are certain analytic techniques now with AI, machine learning, deep learning. Jeff, as you said before, you can take some of the, you know, radiographic reads and really understand what's going on there. You can utilize the clinician's notes because we all know while the clinicians should be completing the structured fields, they don't have time, so they put it all in the notes. So what can we, you know, abstract from those notes so we can have a better, a deeper understanding of what's happening to that patient?
Any other topics on technologies or on analytics that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I only have 22 minutes according to the clock here. So some of these technologies have been around for a while, but it's when they mature and be fit for the purposes we're doing. So let me pick something like natural language processing, which has existed for a long time, but actually is going through quite an acceleration in terms of the utility. And even at this last ASCO, we presented the fact that we could actually bring NLP tools into a lung cancer data set, start reading the unstructured portion of the record, and achieve an accuracy recall comparable to human curation on those terms. That's actually huge because human curation is kind of considered by expert, like usually nurse curators, tumor registrars consider the standard. And if I can now process much more vast amounts of information, maybe even do it in real time, which has utility for a provider, that actually becomes very material because a good portion of what has to do with outcomes of interest, adverse events, and other characteristics isn't in the drop-down menu of the structured fields of the actual EMR that you're doing it. Same thing in radiology. One of the things we're super excited about is we can look at radiomics features that can actually determine a genomic status of a tumor based on radiographics features. Now, if I'm only doing 10, 15% actually next generation sequencing, the ability to grab that from another modality that's used on 100% of the patients actually adds quite a bit of power. And again, these aren't at odds with each other, they complement each other in terms of what you do.
And then how can you get that information back to the clinician in real time so they can make the right diagnosis and get that patient on the right treatment at the right time?
Exactly.
I mean, that to me is really how we blow this, you know, particular.
Well, and I think one of the things that Jeff touched on is these complementary ways of being able to take something to scale. And so when we think about a lot of, you know, and there's been a lot of mention of health equity.
Right.
And when we think about, you know, if you're talking about doing deep sequencing on a tumor and you can find something that is comparable through radiographic images, then you have a much more cost-effective way in places like rural America where the ability to do that rapidly for the genomics isn't possible, but you have an alternative that can improve outcomes.
Right. And you have an alternative where, to all of your points, the data is already being collected.
Right.
And it's being collected at scale across America. So if we're thinking about longitudinality, and I'll pass this back to you, I know you've had decades and decades of experience with registries. How are registries using these novel data that are coming online now, and what would you like to see next?
So I think one of the big challenges, and I guess opportunities really, is integrating all of these different data. So, for us, we have several hundred thousands of people with individual level consent. So a big thing for us is how can we now link these individuals to all of these other data sources, maintain that individual level data so that we have not just the lifestyle and the medical and the genomics and so on, but really start to go very deep in how we can characterize these individuals. Earlier this morning, I don't recall who it was, they talked about sometimes you have these biobanks of convenience. I think that one of the challenges is again, and Susan touched on this, is being intentional about not collecting data for the sake of data and saying, here's what we have, figure out how it may be usable, because it's going to be junk in, junk out, right? And so I think that there is now an increasing focus on how can we actually collect a broad, rich amount of data, linking all these different data sources to be able to have things augmenting what we're capturing from the patient themselves. And all of us is doing it. We're obviously doing it at ACS. There are several other efforts within different managed care systems. I think that that's going to really be that intermediate between true real-world data and then RCTs.
We've been thinking a lot about social determinants of health, right? So how, particularly within the context of a community oncology clinic, what variables will help that patient get to treatment, stay on treatment, and have the best outcomes? So things like, to your point, if we think about social determinants of health, we want to make sure that we're collecting the information that's actionable by the clinician at the clinical site, not just a lot of data that they won't be able to do anything about. So could it be, there's a food desert or a transportation desert, or there's a necessity to have a translator. Any of that information we collect, we want to make sure that it's structured in such a way that the clinician can act on it and that patient can get the best care and the best outcomes.
So, you look like you're going to direct something to me too, but I just maybe building on my colleagues here, this notion that you have longitudinality and also kind of maybe even multi-settings that can kind of be brought together. Registries oftentimes were single institutional, and actually you know what you know about just that narrow population there. But as I was listening to this notion that it actually come from multi-institutional, multi-setting, and can be community, now as we heard from Rob, rural, could be different, and actually start to bring that together, that's a level of insight across different subgroups that had different levels of access and economic characteristics and kind of prior history of disease than was there before. The nice thing about a registry model is it's actually sort of a study design, in the sense it's usually under a protocol, et cetera. So as a data set, it can actually take on a more robust form. It can support a wider array of decision making. So I think the field of even kind of what we consider registries, that bar is actually going to go up, and I think that's a very positive thing as well. So
we're seeing basically a cancer registries 2.0 that takes some of the standard data that was historically collected and is being augmented and it's being defragmented in a way that will become insightful. And I wanted to double down a bit on the SDOH, on the socioeconomic consumer type data, because we talked a lot about the omics, genomics, proteomics, lots of technology coming in, and we're actually really drilling down on molecular mechanisms and understanding those well, but societal mechanisms that lead to a higher incidence of cancer, I feel like there's still a ways away to go there. So I was reading somewhere that the NCI will be collaborating with the USDA to look at poverty and cancer. And as we're thinking about data that perhaps is not visible within the four walls of healthcare, like socioeconomic data, how do you think that will impact how we think about cancer research in the future?
So I'll start, and I will say that it is critical that we look at these systemic and upstream issues. So it's not just about having available different tools. Take biomarker testing, for instance. Biomarker testing varies very much by geography, by health system type, and hospital. And so we're not able to deliver the same quality of care because of a lack of biomarker testing in some places compared to others. And we know that there are systemic issues that drive that. And so that access to equitable preventive services, to equitable treatment options is a major issue. I live in Atlanta, and while we have an NCI-designated comprehensive cancer center in Atlanta, if you live in Southwest Atlanta, which is one of the poorer parts of the city, you have to take 2 buses and a train to get there, or you have to pay $25 a day to park there. So if you think about just the barriers alone based on where you live, being able to get to that treatment facility, there are huge systemic issues that we have to solve to truly make it equitable.
You know, we did a study a few years ago, non-small cell lung cancer, trying to understand within the context of community oncology clinics how many patients are getting biomarker testing. And the number was just, it was like a slap in the face, because you thought, wow, for non-small cell lung cancer, you should see 70, 80, 90% of the patients getting tested. But you're right, I mean, some of that is disproportionately due to the fact that you have patients that are scattered all over the United States and not near a facility that can do the appropriate testing. So the SDOH, really understanding what are the key variables that are driving care, and for us, again, within the community context, is so important to ensure that they have the best, patients have the best outcomes.
So one, we should be super heartened everybody up here who's passionate about it, clearly has been thoughtful about it, and integrating the work. I think your question's a really good one. And actually, if I go, I think Susan, you even started talking about prior history of treatment diagnostic activity, maybe even before the cancer event. So you almost have to sort of take a slightly broader lens. Like we're beginning to move towards where we have social determinants coverage of about 95, 93% or so of all the data we save. So we're looking at about 6 million lives. We now have kind of the ability to kind of bring that in, because it does provide insights. And social determinants here, sometimes it's not just racial and kind of ethnic, but economic has an enormous, which you've heard from all the comments here, but also this ability to bring perhaps medical claims data even prior to the oncological episode of care, may even tell you what the prior treatment history, because sometimes you find screening activity was substantially lower, and then access oftentimes gets determined because physicians in rural and other settings won't actually place a family into a position of financial distress. So the clinical decision may actually be determined by the economics of that individual patient, which the physicians also feel is personally responsible to them. So when you start bringing these factors in, you start illuminating all sorts of features that actually explain the healthcare system, the outcomes of interest, et cetera. But you do need the data, and the data do now exist to actually start to bring that together at scale.
Excellent. So as we're talking about the continuum of cancer research, there's prevention, there's detection, there's actual care, and then there's the overall quality of life. If you could pull one lever anywhere in that continuum where data could provide more insight, what would that be?
Jeff?
I don't know why I get so.
Or 2.
Yeah, there'd probably be multiple levers, but so Susan said something which was almost like make data actionable to the care providers. Personally and kind of professionally, we're trying to spend a lot of time thinking about how do you make clinical research activities no more complicated than actually practicing the standard care medicine itself. And this idea that we can actually move research more strongly into a community setting, the fact that it can even move out into a rural setting, the fact for the providers in that setting that have no infrastructure to do research, actually, and patients who aren't clear what it means to participate in research, that if you can truly integrate that in. Now, what that actually means is the data that actually sit captive in a lot of these systems weren't really designed to be used for that particular purpose, which is this notion that, even as Susan put it, like, can I make data that exists now accessible, actionable, and convenient to a decision-making process that's in there. And that would actually allow not just treatment decisions to kind of be more precise, more timely, understand what response looks like, but also think about clinical research activities, whether it's registrational or even post-approval, actually more integral to that care management process. If that actually can be accomplished, which comes off the back of a lot of what we're learning about real-world data, because these are the data that are actually now being used and configured and presented in different forms. It's just not the classic kind of research program or project. And again, I think prospective and retrospective will start to play together a lot more responsibly as a system if we kind of take some of the principles that have been discussed here today. But I actually think that's getting more actionable and more possible, and I think it'll look fundamentally different even over the course of the next 2 to 5 years.
Yeah, I mean, the retrospective, prospective perspective is exactly, I think, where we need to move, particularly for oncology care. So understanding, again, that patient's journey up until the time they get their diagnosis, what happens in their treatment, but then to follow them out over time to understand, you know, the efficacy and safety of the treatments. Do they have to be retreated? What other variables are involved in that care until hopefully survivorship? I think that's where we can really start to answer some complex questions that we just you can't do within the context of a randomized controlled clinical trial. Yeah. And you can't do it in the context of retrospective real-world data studies.
Well, I am a prevention researcher, so it's probably no surprise that I'm going to say that, you know, focusing on how to collect those data and as part of whether it's the medical record or directly from patients, you are oftentimes going to the doctor from childhood. And how do we actually glean those data so that we can understand what leads to diagnosis? I mean, the goal should hopefully be to prevent those cancers that are preventable. Right. And we know that roughly 40% of cancers are attributed to unhealthy lifestyle, tobacco use, obesity, physical inactivity, and poor diet. So how can we intervene there? And then how can we capture the necessary data to better understand what leads to diagnosis, what leads to, you talked about screening. Yeah. There's so much that we don't know about the gaps between when you have a screening mammogram, for instance. How can we glean out of the data? What was the follow-up? Why was the follow-up happening the way that it did to get to the diagnosis? This is when you had your mammogram, this is when the diagnosis happened, but there's all these periods of data in between. How can we actually start to close those gaps to get from pre-diagnosis through survivorship in a much cleaner and more comprehensive way?
Right. But if you think about it, the screening takes place in one facility, one type of facility, and then the treatment, particularly within the community oncology, takes place in a totally different facility. Oh. And those data, interoperability is... interoperability. There you go. That's right. And those data need to talk to each other, and it needs to be seamless, so you do have that.
Yes, when we're trying to collect screening mammograms and then diagnostic information, yes, it would be great if they talk to each other.
By the way, this is a really broad problem, right? So it's a broad problem just for screening, but also even if you take a look at just even take a hematological malignancy like early multiple myeloma, smoldering is probably found in a primary care setting first before somebody even gets referred over to a hematologist. So this idea of cross-setting kind of activity. A lot of urological cancers, so bladder comes from, heavily associated with smokers, but may actually be in a urological setting before it transfers into a medical oncological setting. So this cross-setting view and different sets of flows and activities actually is becoming a lot easier to get a vantage point on, to confederate, but it's actually not historically the way that a lot of the research activities were brought together.
That's great. And what I'm hearing here is a little bit of an interoperability challenge, but also fragmentation and siloization, because if you're having one piece of information that's found here, and then 2 years later there's another piece of information that's found elsewhere, bringing that together and connecting those dots seems to be important. But also a lot of what I'm hearing is hope. So I hear a lot of positivity in where healthcare data in oncology is going. So if you think of today and then if you think of 2030, at the end of the decade, I'd love to hear your predictions. What is different? What is actually the landscape of oncology data look like in 2030 that might not be the case today?
So I think there'll be interoperability across all the different settings. I think that there'll be a better articulation of what that patient goes through to get the care and during their care, so supportive services can be wrapped around them. And I do think that we'll have those end-to-end registries where we look at the retrospective and prospective data so we can answer questions that are far more complex than we're thinking about today. So I think we're on a great path to that, and I'm hoping it'll be before 2030. Yeah.
I would agree with Susan, and I do think that we'll get there. I hope we get there equitably. I hope we get there in community cancer hospitals that are less resourced. This morning in one of the sessions, there was conversation about the fact that, the funding around this. How do we incentivize hospitals that are already stretched thin to be able to aggregate and manage these data and make them available? Because that aspect of health equity, I think, is going to be critical to driving down mortality.
So in cancer, Rob said something else which was, kind of both positive and kind of negative at the same time, which is cancer outcomes are one of the few that seems to be improving across multiple classes of diseases. That's actually pretty material because I actually think and you're hearing a little bit in how we're responding, but the notion of that research may actually be considered an ongoing continuum of activity where we don't think about it as little discrete intervals, but even the surveillance of a patient post-RCT or post-care where I may confederate claims and primary back to the oncological setting, and that it's got that semi-chronic characteristic, but now I'm confederating those data sources that actually do unify things and give me some visibility. I want to be organ sparing because they're going to get treated again. That's a very different paradigm of care. So how do I want to screen and I want to prevent and I want to do it earlier and begin doing that. So there's all sorts of intra-strategies that kind of come together. So, at least my hope and wish and anticipation, and I'm also an optimist that this is coming together, is that data stream and technologies will become more automated, more integral, more accessible, and the research questions will be framed in the right way, and then it'll come back and be more actionable kind of as well.
Oh, that's fabulous. I mean, I'm hearing a lot of interesting things, both more data is coming online, deeper data, the science is reaching the data, so data linkage as a science, and general overall positivity. So, I mean, if you're thinking about the patients that are affected by cancer diagnosis can be life-changing, can be life-shaping for the patient themselves, for their caretakers, and for their community. So anything that we can do to get better insights out there in the next decade is going to be both welcome and then very exciting. So with that, I wanted to take the time to thank our panelists today, and please join me in a round of applause.
Thank you, Liz.